In 1983, the Austrian army adopted a pistol unlike anything in military history. Its frame was plastic. The firearms world lost its mind. Journalists called it revolutionary. Soldiers called it the future. Today, half the handguns on Earth copy it, and its maker's name has become a synonym for the word pistol itself. Glock, the company that invented the polymer handgun. Except it didn't. 13 years earlier, in 1970, a pistol with a plastic frame was already sitting on a production line in West Germany. It carried 18 rounds in an age of 7-shot pistols. It had a striker instead of a hammer. The exact system your local police department trusts today. And it could do something no Glock has ever done. Snap onto a shoulder stock and fire bursts at 2,200 rounds per minute from a machine that fit in a holster. That pistol was the Heckler Koch P70. It invented the future, and the future destroyed it anyway. This is the biography of a machine that was right about everything, 13 years too early. To understand why this pistol exists at all, you have to understand the specific nightmare it was built for. Because the VP70 wasn't designed to win contracts or impress shooters. It was designed for the end of the world. It's the late 1960s. Oberndorf am Neckar, a small town in the hills of southwest Germany, home to Heckler and Koch. West Germany sits on the most dangerous border on the planet, the seam between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And NATO's own war games keep producing the same ugly result. If Soviet armored divisions come through the Fulda Gap, the front line doesn't hold. It moves, fast, deep into German territory. Which raises a question no army wanted to say out loud. What do civilians do when the tanks are already past them? West German defense planners had an answer, borrowed from the darkest chapters of the previous war. A people's resistance, militias, stay-behind units, ordinary Germans, farmers, factory workers, students, armed for guerrilla warfare behind Soviet lines. And that plan had a hole in it the size of a country. You cannot arm 1 million untrained civilians with precision machined pistols that take a skilled worker hours to mill from a block of steel. A Walther P38 was a fine weapon. It was also, by the logic of total war, far too slow and far too expensive to make. So the requirement that landed at Heckler and Koch read like heresy. Build a pistol that costs a fraction of anything on the market. Build it with almost no machining. Stamp it, mold it, assemble it. Build it so simple that someone who has never touched a gun can load it, fire it, and strip it in minutes. Build it to survive mud, neglect, and storage in a barn wall for a decade. And give it as many rounds as physically possible, because a partisan doesn't get to carry spare magazines. HK even named the project with brutal honesty, Volkspistole, the People's Pistol, model of 1970, VP70. And here's where the engineers made the decision that puts this gun in history books, the decision everyone would later credit to Austria. To hit that cost target, the frame, the skeleton of the pistol, the part that had been forged or machined from steel since the invention of the automatic handgun, would not be metal at all. It would be polyamide, plastic. Understand what that word meant in 1970. Plastic was toys. Plastic was kitchen radios and cheap combs. Telling a soldier his sidearm was plastic was telling him his life had been entrusted to a Tupperware lid. There was no precedent, no market research saying customers would accept it. Every instinct in the industry said they wouldn't. HK did it anyway because the math didn't care about instincts. A molded polymer frame came out of the press in seconds, at a fraction of the cost, immune to rust, lighter in the hand. For a weapon meant to be produced in the millions while missiles were in the air, plastic wasn't a compromise. Plastic was the entire point, But the frame was only the first taboo this pistol broke. To make the Volkspistol real, cheap, simple, nearly unbreakable, the engineers at Oberndorf had to violate 3 unwritten laws of handgun design. The plastic frame was merely the most visible one. The second violation went deeper, into the very heart of the mechanism, into how the gun locks up the moment 9mm fire erupts inside it. Every other manufacturer on the planet agreed you could not do what HK was about to do with this cartridge. HK did it with a straight face. And it worked, right up until the moment it became the reason shooters started to hate this gun. Pick up a VP70, and the first thing you notice is what's missing. No hammer at the back, no external safety levers cluttering the slide, no screws holding grip panels. There are no grip panels because the grip is the frame, molded as one seamless piece of polyamide around a skeleton of steel inserts at the stress points. The magazine release sits at the heel, European style. The whole gun looks like it was drawn by someone who had never been told what a pistol is supposed to look like. That was the method. The engineers at Oberndorf didn't refine the conventional handgun. They interrogated it. Every part had to justify its existence against one question. Can a factory under wartime pressure make this by the million? And 3 sacred rules of pistol design failed that interrogation. Rule 1, the frame. You already know. Polymer instead of steel. But look closer at what that choice actually bought. A machined steel frame demanded a skilled operator, a milling machine, and hours per unit. The VP70's frame came out of an injection mold in under a minute, ready to use. No finishing, no bluing, no rust. Ever. The gun weighed 820 grams empty. A Colt M1911 weighed over 1,100. And where the American gun's frame could corrode in a jungle or a flooded cellar, the German one could be buried in wet earth and dug up shooting. Rule 2 was the one competitors considered genuinely insane: how the gun locks. Here's the problem every pistol designer faces. When a 9x19 Parabellum cartridge fires, chamber pressure spikes to roughly 2,400 bars. If the slide flies backward while that pressure is still peaking, the case can rupture and vent hot gas into the shooter's hand. That's why virtually every 9mm pistol since the Luger uses a locked breech, barrel, and slide travel together for a few millimeters, mechanically latched, until pressure drops to safe levels. Locking mechanisms work beautifully. They are also precisely the kind of finely fitted, machined-to-tolerance hardware the Volkspistol was forbidden to have. So HK deleted the lock. The VP70 is a straight blowback pistol, the same brutally simple principle as a cheap .22, scaled up to a full-power military cartridge. Nothing latches the slide to the barrel. The only things holding the breech closed at the moment of ignition are the mass of the slide and the strength of the recoil spring. Which is why both are enormous. A thick, heavy slide and a spring so stiff that racking it became the gun's unofficial fitness test. The barrel, no longer needing locking lugs, became a simple fixed tube, pinned rigidly to the frame, which, as a side effect, is exactly what accuracy engineers dream about. One moving assembly. No tilting, no cams, no unlocking geometry. Nothing to wear out, nothing to fit by hand. Rule 3. The fire control. Since the 1900s, real pistols had hammers, external or internal, with sears, disconnectors, safety levers, dozens of small machined and sprung parts. The VP70 replaced the entire orchestra with a spring-loaded striker riding inside the slide. Pull the trigger. The striker draws back, then snaps forward. Release, repeat. Double action only, every shot identical. No manual safety needed because the striker is never held cocked. The gun physically cannot fire unless the trigger travels its full arc. Count the moving parts in that firing mechanism and you get 4. 4. A Walther, P38's trigger group alone had more than a dozen. Field stripping, the VP70, required no tools in about 8 seconds. Pull down 2 latches, slide comes off, done. A conscript could learn it in one demonstration. A partisan could do it in the dark. And then there's the part of the design nobody could argue with. Down inside that plastic grip sat a double-stack magazine holding 18 rounds of 9mm. In 1970, that number was almost obscene. The M1911 held 7. The Walther P38 held 8. Even the celebrated high-capacity Browning high-power topped out at 13. A militiaman with one loaded VP70 carried more ready ammunition than 2 soldiers with government-issue sidearms, which for a fighter with no supply line and no second magazine wasn't a luxury. It was the difference between a weapon and a paperweight. If you're starting to see why this forgotten pistol deserves a biography, a plastic frame in 1970, 4 moving parts, 18 rounds, that subscribe button is the easiest way to keep these machines from being forgotten. Because the story is about to get stranger. Every one of those decisions traded something away, and HK knew it. The blowback system saved money but punished the hand. The striker system saved parts but buried a cost deep inside the mechanism, one that would stay invisible right up until the gun went looking for customers. But first, none of this, not the plastic, not the blowback, not the 4 parts, was the feature HK was proudest of. The real party trick was a slab of polymer that didn't even attach to the pistol. It hung on your belt, and the moment you clicked it into the grip, the VP70 stopped being a pistol at all. It looks like nothing. A hollow shell of rigid polymer, flat and angular, about the length of a forearm. On the march, it rides on your belt with the pistol locked inside. A holster, hard and weatherproof. But take the pistol out, flip the shell around, and press its steel claw into the channel at the back of the grip until it clicks, and you are no longer holding a pistol. You're holding a machine pistol. And the transformation isn't a metaphor, it's mechanical. Inside that grip channel sits a small actuator. The stock's claw physically depresses it, and that engagement unlocks a selector switch on the stock itself, a lever your thumb finds naturally. Setting 1. Semi-automatic, normal pistol. Setting 2, marked 3. Pull the trigger once, and the VP70 fires a 3-round burst. Detach the stock, and the full auto capability doesn't just switch off, it ceases to exist. The pistol alone physically cannot fire a burst. The brain of the machine gun lives in the holster. Now, the number that made engineers do a double take. The burst cycles at 2,200 rounds per minute. For scale, an MP5 submachine gun fires at around 800, an M16 at about 750. The VP70, with its stock attached, spat 3 bullets in roughly 80 milliseconds, literally faster than the blink of a human eye. Here's the thing. That absurd rate wasn't a side effect. It was the whole idea. Full automatic fire from a handgun-sized weapon is famously useless. The recoil of the first shot throws the muzzle off target before the second arrives, and the rest of the magazine decorates the sky. Every machine pistol from the Mauser Schnellfeuer to the Beretta 93R wrestled with this. HK's answer was counterintuitive. Don't slow the gun down. Speed it up until physics can't keep up. At 2,200 rounds per minute, all 3 bullets have left the barrel before recoil has time to lift the muzzle in any meaningful way. The shooter feels 1 long shove instead of 3 kicks. 3 holes appear on the target in a vertical line, a handspan apart at combat distance. A burst that behaves like a single shotgun blast of aimed fire from a weapon you carry on a belt. And notice the elegance underneath. The blowback system, the heavy slide, the fixed barrel. The very features that made the gun cheap. are also what let it survive this abuse. There's no delicate locking mechanism to hammer itself apart at that cyclic rate. The VP70 could do 2,200 RPM precisely because it was primitive. This is where the two lives of the model split. HK built the VP70M for militaire, with the grip channel, the selector interface, and the stock. And for the civilian and police market, the VP70Z Zivil, identical in the hand, but with no channel, no actuator, no burst capability under any circumstances. 2 catalog entries, 1 philosophy. The M was the actual Volkspistole, the doomsday tool. The Z was an attempt to make the tooling pay for itself in peacetime. Put the full package together and you see the concept in its final form. In peacetime, a militiaman keeps a holstered pistol, legally and logistically a sidearm, cheap to issue, easy to store. On the day the tanks roll, he clicks the holster into the grip and owns a burst-firing carbine with 18 rounds, a weapon occupying the exact niche of a submachine gun, at a fraction of the cost of an MP5, small enough to hide under a coat, simple enough that his first lesson can happen after the war's already started. 1 object, 2 weapons, and the switch between them takes 2 seconds. If the silhouette of a pistol wearing its holster as a shoulder stock feels familiar, it should. Mauser C96, the broom handle that armed half the revolutions of the early 20th century. Winston Churchill's sidearm at Omdurman with its iconic wooden holster stock. HK's engineers grew up around that legacy. Mauser's factory stood in the same Oberndorf hills. The VP70M was that idea's last serial production reincarnation. The old trick reborn in polymer with the machine gun brain hidden inside. On paper, then, Oberndorf had done something no one has really done since. Invented the future twice in a single object. The polymer striker-fired pistol, the template for the next half-century of handguns. And the holster that turns a sidearm into a burst weapon, a concept so ahead of its time that armies are still circling it today with their stock machine pistols for special units. Which makes the next fact land like a slap. By 1973, 3 years into production, with brochures printed and demonstrations run for half the armies of the Western world, the number of major military contracts for the VP70 stood at 0. The Bundeswehr passed. NATO partners passed. Police forces tested it and sent it back. The weapon designed for 1 million users couldn't find 1,000. And the reason wasn't the plastic, wasn't the blowback, wasn't the price. The reason lived inside the trigger guard. And every single person who ever picked up a VP70 discovered it within 1 second. Put your finger on a VP70's trigger and pull. Keep pulling. Somewhere around 9 kilograms of pressure, 20 pounds, roughly 4 times a modern service pistol. The striker finally releases. Shooters compared it to squeezing a stiff hand exerciser, 1 full rep per shot. German testers had a drier verdict. Precision shooting with this weapon, they noted, was simply not achievable. That trigger wasn't a defect. It was the bill for everything the gun did right, arriving all at once. Remember the 4-part striker mechanism. Its simplicity came from doing all the work in one motion. Your trigger finger compresses the striker spring from 0 on every single pull. No hammer pre-cocked by the slide, no assistance, no shortcuts. Because shortcuts meant parts, and parts were forbidden. HK even advertised the logic. A long, heavy pull is a safety feature. No lever to forget, nothing to snag. The gun fires only when deliberately fired. For a panicked farmer pulling a pistol out of a barn wall, that was arguably correct. For everyone else, it was a deal-breaker stacked on top of 2 more. The blowback action, with its massive slide slamming back and forth unlatched, delivered a sharp, clanging recoil that made a 9mm feel like a magnum. and the trigger dragged practical accuracy down with it. In police trials, groups from the VP70 ran 2 to 3 times wider than from a Walther P38E, a design from 1938. The pistol built around a precision-friendly fixed barrel couldn't cash that advantage, because no human finger could hold the sight steady through a pull that heavy. Then came the problem no engineer could fix: 1970s buyers looking at a plastic gun. Procurement officers were men who'd carried steel through Korea and the Congo. To them, polymer wasn't innovation, it was a category error. The objections were endless. It'll crack in Arctic cold. It'll warp in desert heat. It'll age like a cheap radio casing. HK ran the tests. The frame survived temperature extremes, solvents, being run over, and it changed nothing, because the objection was never really technical. It was cultural. A weapon is a promise, and nobody in 1973 believed a promise made of plastic. And beneath all of it sat the quietest killer: the war. The VP70 was built for refused to happen. West Germany never created its militia. The political appetite for arming civilians evaporated, détente arrived, and the entire Volkspistole scenario dissolved into filing cabinets. The pistol optimized for a customer of 1 million found that the customer had never been born. So the sales map ended up almost empty. No Bundeswehr, no NATO adoptions. Instead, scattered export contracts in the low thousands. Portugal took some, Morocco, Paraguay. The most documented user became Portugal's paramilitary Guarda Nacional Republicana, a pistol tooled for mass production sold over its entire life, roughly what Glock would later ship in a good week. Which brings us to 1982 and the twist of the knife. That year, Austria's army ran a tender for a new service pistol. Among the bidders, a curtain rod and knife manufacturer from Deutsche Wagram named Gaston Glock, a man who had never designed a firearm, but who knew injection-molded polymers intimately. His Glock 17 read like a corrected exam paper of the VP70. Polymer frame, kept. Striker mechanism, kept. Double-stack 17-round magazine, kept. And then the fixes, aimed precisely at every wound described above. A locked breech instead of blowback, taming the slide mass and the recoil, and the safe action trigger, in which the slide precocks the striker most of the way, leaving the finger a light 2.5 kilogram pull, with safety handled by internal automatic blocks instead of raw spring weight. Same formula, same heresies. 1 decade later, into a market that the VP70 had already bled on, absorbing the ridicule, forcing the industry to run the plastic frame debate to exhaustion. Glock won the Austrian contract, then the FBI era, then the world. Journalists crowned him the inventor of the plastic pistol, and almost nobody looked up what the letters VP had already stood for. Heckler Koch kept the VP70 in the catalog through the decade, sales flatlining, and in 1989, quietly, without announcement, shut the line down. In business terms, a failure, full stop. And if this were a business story, it would end here. But this is a biography. And this particular machine turned out to have the strangest fate a failed product can have. Because 3 years before the line closed in a film studio outside London, a props department picked up the VP70 for a job no other pistol on earth could do. The gun that failed to sell as the present was about to be typecast permanently as the future. In 1986, the armorers of James Cameron's Aliens faced a specific problem. Equip the colonial Marines of the year 2179 with weapons an audience would believe. Most of the arsenal they built from scratch, but the sidearm, the pistol strapped to the Marines, needed no modification at all. They simply bought VP7s. The seamless polymer body, the hammerless slide, the silhouette with no visible screws or seams. It already looked like it had been printed in a colony fabricator 2 centuries from now. A design too futuristic for buyers in 1973 turned out to be exactly futuristic enough for 2179. That casting decision became the pistol's second life. For a generation of viewers, the VP70 wasn't the gun that failed. It was the gun from aliens, full stop. And when those viewers grew up and got disposable income, they went looking for it. Today, a common VP70Z, the civilian model, the one that barely sold, trades at prices its 1970s dealers would find hallucinatory. The real grail is the VP70M with its stock. Because the stock converts the pistol to burst fire, it's regulated as a machine gun component. In most countries, transferable examples are so scarce that collectors track individual serial numbers, and complete sets change hands for the price of a car. The market has delivered its verdict in the bluntest language markets have. The failure became the treasure. But the money is the shallow part of the vindication. The deep part is standing in every gun shop on Earth. Run down the checklist of what the VP70 introduced in 1970. Polymer frame. Today, the majority of new service pistols sold worldwide are polymer framed. Glock, Smith & Wesson M&P, Sig Sauer, P320 Walther, PDP CZP10. Steel frames are the niche now. Plastic is the default. Striker firing. The standard mechanism of nearly every police and military sidearm adopted in the last 30 years. The hammer, dominant for a century, is the one that became exotic. Double-stack high-capacity magazine as a design baseline. Universal. 3 heresies, 3 industry standards. The VP70 didn't lose the argument. It won every point, posthumously, under other people's names. Even its own maker eventually said so, in the only language corporations speak, product code. In 2014, Heckler Koch launched its new flagship, a polymer-framed, striker-fired service pistol built to beat Glock at Glock's own game. They named it the VP9, Volkspistole. 44 years after the original, the company reached back and picked up exactly the 2 letters it had once quietly retired. No press release mentioned the ancestor. None needed to. So why did the original die? Not because it was wrong, because it was early. And early is a precise engineering condition, not a poetic one. The polymer science of 1970 was a decade behind what Gaston Glock could buy off the shelf in 1982. The market hadn't yet been softened by a decade of plastic in cars, cameras, and aircraft interiors. And HK, committed to its doomsday brief, refused the one compromise that would have saved it, adding parts to fix the trigger, because the Volkspistole logic said parts were the enemy. Glock's real genius wasn't the plastic. It was the timing and the willingness to spend 5 extra components where HK had spent 0. The lesson generalizes far beyond firearms. Being first is a fact. Being adopted is a business. And the graveyard of technology is full of machines that were right too soon. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the machines behind the legends, and the legends that turned out to be borrowed, subscribe and drop a comment with the firearm whose real story you want told next. There are more objects like this one, sitting in the shadow of the names that got the credit. Because here is the final accounting for the Heckler Koch 5P70. Roughly 22,500 units in 19 years. 0 major contracts. Then a quiet death in 1989, 3 years before polymer pistols began conquering the planet. By every metric its own era could measure, it lost. But metrics expire and machines don't. Every polymer frame that comes out of an injection mold today, every striker that snaps forward in a police holster, every double-stack magazine slapped into a service pistol, all of it runs on decisions made in Oberndorf in 1970 for a war that never came, by engineers the world forgot to thank. Glock won the market. But look closely at the pistol on any modern officer's hip, and you're looking at the same machine. This story began with the VP70, wearing a different name, 13 years late to its own victory. And this time, finally, it got to win.